You're listening to Front Row with me, Tom Sutcliffe. We don't have sensitivity readers for our interviews on this programme because, well, they are live and it would be too late. But we have talked to a sensitivity reader tonight. Philippa Willitts, who specialises in disability and LGBT issues, talks about the process of looking over the writer's shoulder and making suggestions with the novelist Zia Heider Rahman, who doesn't like that idea very much. Now, all writers hope for sensitive readers, but there has been some debate recently about sensitivity readers, specialist researchers used by some publishers now to check manuscripts for hidden assumptions or unconscious bias. Authors as varied as Joanne Harris and Jamie Oliver are happy to use them, but others have anxieties. The writer Kate Clanchy, who's been through a difficult time herself recently and parted company with her publisher after being accused of using racist tropes in a non-fiction memoir, Some Kids I Taught and What They Taught Me, went so far as to say in a recent article that sensitivity readers are corrupting literature. We thought we'd talk to a sensitivity reader, Philippa Willitts, who advises on disability and LGBT issues, and a writer who has misgivings about the whole idea, Zia Heider Rahman, author of the prize-winning novel In the Light of What We Know. I started by asking Philippa to explain what it is that she actually does.
A sensitivity reader is somebody from a particular community. So in my case, that's the LGBT community or the disability community, who will read a manuscript before it's published and offer advice to the author on how members of those communities are represented in their book, say they have a disabled character, and also provide context, background information about why certain terminology might be preferred, the takes that disabled people may have about particular language, that kind of thing. It's just about offering advice and giving a perspective they might not have considered.
Some of the reactions to kind of recent discussions about sensitivity readers have suggested that it's a form of censorship by stealth, but authors don't have to accept your advice, do they?
No, absolutely. I make recommendations, and sometimes I will say, for instance, people sometimes worry about saying things like they went for a walk. Will that offend wheelchair users? And virtually never does. But I will sometimes say, I'm letting you know that people are concerned about this, but I actually don't think it's a worry. I don't think you need to worry about saying, I'll see you later to a blind person. And I think it's interesting also that the author at the centre of this discussion has republished without taking the advice of the sensitivity readers. So we don't have this kind of massive authority to interrupt the process.
Does the work you do cover a whole range?
I would say about 3/4 of the books I've worked on have been non-fiction. The remaining fiction ones have been a mixture of adult fiction, contemporary fiction, young adult.
So when you're working on non-fiction, you are a researcher, aren't you?
Yeah, to a degree, a specialised researcher with a particular perspective.
Can you give me some examples of the kind of intervention you make where you say this does matter? I mean, you've just given 2 examples of ones where you think I don't think this is going to be a problem. Can you give us some examples of where you think it might?
Sure. A lot of it is quite technical. People using terminology in one way when it might mean something else. People talking about, say, the gay community when they mean the LGBT community as a whole. I looked into whether there was a character who was an amputee in a novel. The author had them crawling, and I looked into whether it was possible for a lower limb amputee to crawl, offered advice on that.
What about language, though? I mean, one of the things that Kate Clanchy referred to was a sensitivity reader suggesting that using the term disfigure about a polluted landscape was a problem. Would you think that was a problem?
That would be the kind of thing that I would highlight as you may want to think about this, but I don't think it's a priority in that context. I recommended changing the use of the word homosexual in one book just because it's quite outdated.
It would be a different matter, of course, if that novel was about the 1950s.
Absolutely, yes.
Zia, if I can turn to you, what are your anxieties as a writer about sensitivity readers?
Well, first of all, can I say that what Philippa has just given us are examples that really don't justify the nomenclature of a sensitivity reader. What she said is that she is a good researcher and a good copy editor or a good editor. Sensitivity reading, I think it's just disingenuous to think that it doesn't mean anything more than that. The problem begins when you bring in these normative judgments. It's preposterous to think that disfigure is something even for the author to think about.
Why do you say it's preposterous? Authors should think about all the words they use, shouldn't they?
But not for reasons to do with the sensitivity of some constituency. I think we need to take a step back. It doesn't make sense to think of sensitivity readers without thinking about the broader context in which they appear. It just doesn't. The broader context is one in which writers, and I'm talking about fiction, novelists are finding that their sovereignty is being encroached upon. Their imaginative space is being clipped. And that, I think, is dangerous.
Why do you say their sovereignty is being encroached upon if all they are receiving is advice, which they
because
can
it
ignore?
Isn't. The sensitivity reader has evolved because there is a furore about the perceived politics of a work of art. The notion of relevance of politics to fiction is a faulty one now. Politics is, of course, relevant, but it's not relevant in the way that you would think from watching social media.
I imagine you have read novels written by white writers about the subcontinent or about Afghanistan, which you have written about too, and you've thought they've got this completely wrong. What is wrong with the publisher saying, actually, this is a field we're not fully aware of, the writer might not be, we can redress our overwhelmingly white establishment by getting somebody in to read it?
Well, look, that takes us to some of the details of a novel. If you have a first-person novel, a novel in which the narrator is telling you the story, then, of course, you have to make allowance for the fact that the narrator is making mistakes. Also, what readers and even a sensitivity reader might perceive as a mistake might not actually be a mistake. The responsibility for the errors should lie on the author. In my novel, I use the word Afghan and Afghani to describe people from that country. And a few readers sent me messages saying, why do you use Afghani? It's wrong. Well, actually, no, it's not wrong. If you go to the subcontinent, there are certain people who refer to Afghans as Afghani. And in fact, it really showed the ignorance of the white Western NGO workers.
I don't disagree with Zia that sensitivity reading is a form of copy editing. It's just a form of copy editing that comes from a really informed place. There was a wheelchair using character who was going to a series of parties, and I was able to say there's no way a wheelchair user could go to a series of parties and be able to get into them all. There's no way a wheelchair user could go to a series of parties without ringing every venue in advance and saying, do you have steps? This was a really well thought out character, but the author with no experience of disability, just hadn't considered that.
What happened in that case? Was the author happy then to take on that correction?
Yes, in pretty much every book I've worked with, the author has been keen to do the best representation they can and to avoid causing unnecessary upsets. They want their books to be well received by the communities they're writing about.
Sensitivity reading has emerged in the context of, for instance, people asking whether so-and-so, the author, has the authority, is it his or her place to write a book about, I don't know, Mexican immigrants coming into the US when they're not a Mexican immigrant in the US? That's actually a real example, of course. These sorts of assaults of the author's imagination, we should be allowing anyone to create art from their own imagination, untroubled by the prospect that stupid questions such as, is this your story to tell, will be raised.
Do you have a view about that, Philippa? Do you feel that a writer, say, who writes a main character who is disabled doesn't really have the right to do that?
No, I wouldn't say they don't have the right to do that. I would say that done carefully and, consciously with a lot of research, it can be done really well.
And how do you stop a sensitivity reader from turning into an oversensitivity reader? I mean, what I mean is, because your job is to look for offence, it's always going to be possible to find it, but you may be having offence on behalf of people who don't feel that at all. And of course, a lot of disabled readers will not want to be thought of as a potential occasion for offence. They're just readers.
Absolutely. If you have 10 disabled people in one room, they'll all disagree on the degree to which things should be advised on or corrected or suggested. I think from my point of view, the way I handle that is I spend a lot of time listening to disabled people speak, reading disabled people's writing, so that I've got as wide a perspective as possible, and so that I can then offer advice and suggest how much of a priority I think it should be at the same time.
Do you think, Philippa, that writers have a right to offend readers? I mean, I know offence is complicated. It weighs differently on different people, but it's at heart, do you think that is a writer's right?
I would say yes, but I would back that up by saying that they have the right to do that, but in the modern world, it's unrealistic to expect that that wouldn't come without consequences. So it's not that they can't do it, it's just that it could be rough for them if they do.
But is that and is that why you think publishers are hiring sensitivity readers too? Because they know the social media networks are out there, that they're running scared a little bit of that reaction.
Yeah, to some degree, for sure. You know, I think a lot of authors would prefer to be told something once by a sensitivity reader rather than 100 times in Amazon reviews.
Zia, do you think that presents a threat for the imagination? That, I mean, it's not, as it were, censorship because it's just advice, but that sense that it is hanging over you as a potential may induce a certain amount of self-censorship.
It absolutely does induce that. It also means that publishers are not bidding for books if they think that the book comes with risks. And I know this from authors who've written to me. Doesn't mean that the book won't get published. The authors who have written to me have said that other publishers have bid for the book. Have
you got skin in the game?
Have I?
In this?
Yes,
I do. I said that metaphor, and I suddenly thought, is there any offence in skin in the game?
Well, there you go. It's absurd.
No, but I mean, do you have a book that you kind of haven't published because of?
Oh, yes, I do. I wrote a book from the first person perspective of a woman who very much wants to have a child, and she wants to have it at a time that is, proves really difficult for her because it's competing with another desire of hers. And I can't imagine publishing that. It's just, I don't want the hassle that would come with it.
Can I ask you, did you ask some women to read it? As it were,
yes,
in draft form?
Yeah. Actually, my readers are, women.
So you did employ a sensitivity reader yourself?
No, only because it's not a sensitivity. I didn't employ them for the purpose of getting feedback on the issue of sensitivity. My friend read it in order to tell me if it was a decent book.
Her experience as a woman was critically important there, wasn't it? It was going to tell you things that you might not have known.
Yes. I think so. I mean, actually, no. Well, the thing is, it grew out of a deep experience of my own of watching my best friend, a woman, go through IVF over 5 years and the struggle she went through. So
why not publish?
Well, because such is the atmosphere now that, is this my story to tell? One other thing I would add is that sensitivity readers have emerged at a time when fiction is in free fall. Over 30%, some say 40% fall in sales over the last decade. Publishers are desperate to find some way to save fiction. And you can see how the market has narrowed, how it's now targeting a particular kind of reader, and it's really just pandering.
You're saying that fiction is in free fall, but sales have been up over the last decade.
No, sorry, literary fiction. Sorry. So 4 years ago, the Arts Council of England said that literary fiction is in crisis. Literary fiction sales have fallen. So fiction covers very broad. Yeah, absolutely. All the genre fiction is doing very well, but literary fiction is in free fall.
Sensitivity readers are used in genre fiction too. I think maybe more than in literary fiction.
They might well be.
Let me just go back to Philippa to finish. I mean, Zia obviously has problems with that term sensitivity reader, I think, because it presupposes a notion of delicacy. It's interesting that sensitivity readers, I think, came in mostly from young adult fiction, where there is a notion that the sensibility of the reader is more delicate, is more exposed, is, needs protecting more. Do you think it's as appropriate for adult fiction? And also, do you like the term sensitivity reader yourself?
I don't love the term. No, it's not great, is it? Diversity editor I've heard as well, but again, I'm not a fan. I don't know what the best name is. I do understand. Yes, I do. As I understand it, it did come from young adult fiction. I think there's a place for it in non-fiction, in all kinds of fiction. If the author, I think it's about the motivation of the author. Do they want that pair of eyes looking over their work, or is that something they resist? If it's something they resist, I wouldn't want to do that work for them. If it's something they're seeking out because they want a really good representation of a lesbian character, then I welcome that.
Our thanks to Philippa Willitts and Zia Heider Rahman. And you can find the Kate Clanchy article about her experience with sensitivity readers on the Unheard website. Sam, I wonder what your view about this is. I mean, the theatre is also a place where kind of sensitivities are, easily provoked. Yeah. Do you like the idea of a sensitivity reader as a writer?
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily have an issue with an extra filter or, someone to offer me advice. Your subconscious is your subconscious. And sometimes, as we've seen, you don't always know exactly what's in there. So I think sometimes an extra pair of eyes can be helpful. Has
a director ever done that for you? Said you don't quite understand what this line is doing and or what it's going to do to an audience?
Certainly. I mean, there's a character in Sorry You're Not a Winner who is their lived experience is not my lived experience, and so it was important to listen in that regard to the actor that plays the role and to the director who shares that experience and to other people. Okay. I think that's
Well, we're going to move on to making people sort of angry on purpose, because we live in a golden age for getting furious about things. And